Hello, everybody. I'm just back from a little bit of an East Coast jaunt. I drove around rural Virginia a couple of days ago, and I saw this sign for people who were just listening as a Trump Vance 2024 flag, and then underneath someone has put winner, and that is clear. There's no doubt that Trump and Vance in 2024 are the clear winners in every sense. From the point of view of liberals, it's very concerning. Francis Fukuyama, who might be described as the Pope of American liberalism, believes that the Trump win marks a decisive rejection of liberalism. So it's a historic change. And my guest today on the show, an old friend of our show, Jonathan Rauch, I think agrees. He's described the November election as Tuesday's moral catastrophe. In spite of that moral catastrophe, John Rauch is still around, just back from France, from the south of France. It's a hard place to go, John.
Rough
what
life.
do you mean by a moral catastrophe? I mean, those are strong words.
I mean it in a specific sense. We don't write our own headlines, of course, and that one is a little blunt. What I meant by that is that for the last 8 years, people like me, including me, have done everything in our power to persuade the American electorate that Donald Trump was an unacceptable candidate from the point of view of morality and character and basic decency and observation of the fundamental norms on which our country and Constitution rely. And this election, 2024, was a complete, I think, repudiation of that view. It was an ordinary election. The good news is that it was an ordinary election. We did.
Yeah, and you
not
wrote a
have
piece for
dispute.
Brookings. You're a fellow at Brookings.
Yeah, that's right.
On this ordinary election. So on the one hand, it was ordinary. On the other hand, it was extraordinary. It was a moral catastrophe.
Well, it was, yeah, that's right. The good news is that it was an ordinary election. It was a rerun of 2016. It was an anti-incumbent election. It was close. It was undisputed. We've seen all that before. The bad news for someone like me, who's been saying for 8 years that this guy is not someone who should be anywhere near the White House, is that it was an ordinary election. The voters looked at everything that he's done and everything that people like me said, and they shrugged and they said, well, you know what? You're either wrong or we're not interested. They treated him as you would another candidate. And so from that point of view, this is I think a decisive rejection of what folks like me have been saying, and we have to change.
John, I know you don't have any kids. I've got kids, and I think rule number one of parenting, and I'm certainly not the person to lecture anyone on good or bad, or certainly good parenting. Rule number one of parenting always seemed to me was if you tell a kid enough times that they can't do something, in the end they will. I don't mean to trivialize your argument, but what you just said to me sounded like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the John Rauchs of the world, fellows at Brookings, authors of best-selling books like Constitution of Knowledge, for 8 years you warned the American people that the guy on the ballot, Donald Trump, was a bad deal, that he was a bad man, that he was unethical, all the rest of it. For 8 years you told them, you made it clear, and they have disobeyed you, and this is a crisis. In terms of that narrative, were you collectively, I mean, you can't speak on behalf of your Brookings class, but weren't you asking for trouble by making it so clear that you disapproved of this particular candidate?
Well, it certainly appears that way today, doesn't it? On the other hand, one cannot deny what you said. Clearly, all the things that people like me have said, and many, many other people, the editorial boards of many newspapers, and Frank Fukuyama, a brilliant man and wonderful scholar, they've been rejected, and so they just clearly failed. So you're undoubtedly right. The question is, should we have just shut up this whole time? Should we not have pointed out, for example, that this is someone who led an effort to overthrow the United States government, that this is someone who lied by actual count average of 20 times a day while he was in office? You can't really not point these things out in a liberal democracy, can you? So when I say a moral catastrophe, it means that people like me, we don't know what to do.
Are you saying then, in a sense, that it's a moral catastrophe, not for America, but to quote you, for people like John Rauch, that your ideas that you grew up with, that you clearly believe in, you're one of the upholders ethically, philosophically of liberal ideals. Is this a catastrophe for yourself?
That is exactly what I'm saying. You just said it better.
Well, you said it well, John, a moral catastrophe for yourself. And does that suggest that really you're beginning to question your own ideas, that more than half of America, maybe 51, 52% of the people who voted, suggested that you were wrong?
Well, I'm not a populist. And in fact, as an atheistic homosexual Jew, I'm very used to being part of an unpopular minority and thinking that I was right regardless. And I don't think I can or want to change fundamentally in my view of, for example, the founders, the US Constitution, the benefits of small L liberalism. I don't mean left-wing progressivism. I'm center-right myself, but I mean the ideals of the American founding and the Enlightenment. I still think that there's actually, Fukuyama was right in what he said in the early 90s. There's no real alternative to those things if what you want is peace, prosperity, freedom, and knowledge. But where I think I have to go back to square one is trying to figure out how to make that case. People like me, I assumed that we were the majority, that we spoke for mainstream America, and that Trump was a fringe candidate who had somehow managed to commandeer the commanding heights of politics. And I think someone like you is quicker to understand, no, that it's actually the other way around. Large number of the people, and now clearly a majority of the people, are on his side. And that means that we, people like me, again, liberals of the world, need to recalibrate and understand we're no longer the mainstream. We're now the dissident faction. It's a very different world than we thought we lived in.
Although in a way, it's a return to something. You and I spent some time together this summer at the Liberalism for the 21st Century conference. It was actually put on, I think, by the same people who published your Tuesday's Moral Catastrophe, The Unpopulist. But I wonder, you talk about, in your piece, you talk about something called the moral minority. I mean, isn't that the foundations of classical liberalism? Isn't that what John Stuart Mill, perhaps the most influential of all 19th century liberals, focused on liberalism? What's wrong with being in the moral minority? Is there something insecure about wanting to be in the moral majority, John?
Well, again, Andrew, I think you're exactly right. And the problem is that I forgot that. We had such liberals, people, liberal, again, I always use the word liberal in this conversation. I hope you're
with a small L. We're not talking about left-wing Democrats. We're talking about
right. We're talking about Madison and Jefferson and Burke and Locke and Tocqueville and all of that, the founding ideas of liberal democracy. So we had an easy ride for many years. We assumed that we were the good guys. We were certainly right when the opponents were fascism and communism. And then in the 90s, it appeared that the world had simply come around, and that America was on a straight path to just preserving this model forever. And what we've seen now is that that's not true. What we've seen is a lot of people feel left behind. Now, we knew a lot of people were being left behind. And at the think tank where I work, Brookings, for decades now, we have been hatching ideas every day about how to help those people, retraining, trade adjustment assessment, apprenticeship programs, better forms of welfare. It's all we do all day. is try to help those who are left behind. Nonetheless, it's just as you say. I think we got complacent. I think it's now obvious we got complacent. What else can you say after an election like this?
And yet you talk about this moral minority. Earlier, you defined yourself as an atheist, a homosexual, a Jew, or atheist, or probably a secular Jew.
Yes.
When I think of John Rauch, I would think he's much more comfortable in a minority. I mean, he is a minority guy. I mean, it's your mentality. So what's changed? So your political party with a small p, your liberals, they're in the minority. So what?
So I thought that I was certainly in a minority in my lack of belief in God and in being a member of a minority religion, and especially growing up gay in a world where that made you a pariah. But all of those things, we saw remarkable progress. In the world I grew up in, of course, homosexuality was illegal. You couldn't serve in the military. Marriage was a ridiculous idea. Atheists were the most unpopular people in the country. Polls found that, Gallup results would show that atheists were unelectable to public office. And we just come out of the shadow of the Holocaust. And my father, who is, we're talking about the 1950s in Phoenix, Arizona. He moved to Phoenix because as a Jew, he couldn't get a job in the East Coast because he wasn't in the top half of his law school class. And we saw immense improvements on all those.
I'm sorry to jump in here, John, and I'm not trivializing this, but if he had been in the top half, would he have got a job as a Jew?
Well, what he told me is that because he wasn't in the top half, he couldn't, and he had to move to Phoenix to get a job. So more than that, I can't tell you. But
that's going back to parenting. It was probably smart. You'd never be in even close to being the bottom half of anything.
But when he moved to Phoenix in the 50s, and when I grew up in the 60s, Jews could not join the Phoenix Country Club. So the story that I heard is the story of liberalism, again, small L liberalism, coming through for people like me. And I thought that's the nature of our country, where we are fundamentally, at the end of the day, we may make wrong decisions in the short term, but we are about advancing rights according to liberal doctrine. And so I now feel an outsider in the one category where I always felt an insider. I don't feel it.
I think you would never acknowledge it publicly, but I don't think you're that unhappy about it.
About which?
Being an outsider.
Well, that's interesting. I am unhappy about the decision that my country has taken in a direction that I think is very, very bad for all kinds of reasons, which we can discuss. I am very unhappy that so many people would support a person whose candidacy and character I think are indefensible. I'm certainly unhappy about that. And I'm unhappy about thinking that my country is a different kind of place than I thought. All of those things make me very unhappy. The broader way in which you're maybe right, Andrew, I've never had to think about it quite this way, is it was unhealthy for liberals to become complacent, to become insiders, to not listen, to not notice. And it may be good for us. In fact, it may be necessary for us to start from scratch, which is kind of where I think we are.
I wonder, John, whether one of the problems, and I'm as much of a liberal as you, although I'm always uncomfortable if I'm in the majority by definition. If I'm in the majority, then I'll change my mind and go into the minority. I wonder whether one of the problems, Fukuyama is an old friend of yours, certainly the high priest, the Pope of American liberalism, of course, much misunderstood in terms of his end of history narrative, but he did have and you talked about it earlier, a kind of teleology, and he perhaps still does, the idea of history progressing towards something better. It's Martin Luther King's moral arc of the universe. Might that be one of the problems with American liberalism, that we've accepted this Fukuyama, MLK style teleological narrative that the world is always becoming a better place?
Well, I don't know that I put the Fukuyama thesis quite that way. It wasn't that the world's always becoming a better place, but it was a view of the moral directionality of liberalism. That is, over time, if you have liberal forms of government and economics and epistemology, that is science, the way you go about finding knowledge, that you will over time tend to increase peace, freedom, prosperity, and knowledge. So they were saying that, and I still think that's true, Andrew. I still think that the people proposing various alternatives to liberalism, Christian nationalism or various forms of state enterprise or Chinese-style communism, um, or all the, or postmodernism or wokeism, I think those are bad ideas, and I think they won't work. I think they'll make people less free and less knowledgeable, and there will be more conflict. And so I think Fukuyama was fundamentally actually right. There's really only one system in the 200,000 years of the human species which has surmounted our tribal instincts and allowed us to knit together into a global community, which has over time increased prosperity, knowledge, diminished war and poverty. So I don't challenge that premise. Where I think you're right, and what I think we were too complacent about, is we kind of assumed that would be on autopilot, and that the people who are left behind, for example, or who are unhappy with demographic change or the way the country was changing, that they could just be kind of dismissed, that they would be happy because GDP is growing. And that turns out, of course, to be wrong.
You talk about, I don't know whether you said 20,000 or 2,000 years, but there's the one system over
200,000.
100, wow, it's even more. 100,000, I use that as the title for the interview, John. One system over 100,000 years that
200,000,
200, we'll put it up. 200,
300, depending when you date the dawn
maybe
of
a million.
Homo sapien.
Well, certainly a lot of years.
A lot of years.
Overcome tribalism, but some people might respond, including some people who think of themselves as liberals. Yasha Monk comes to mind. That the idea of overcoming tribalism is itself a kind of unrealistic, almost utopian ideology, that we are, by definition, tribal. In fact, we've had a number of shows on the value of tribalism. There's a guy at Columbia whose book in defense of kind of corporate and social tribalism is actually shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year. So are you suggesting that, in your view at least, you use this word tribalism, it's your word, John, rather than mine, are you suggesting that it's fundamentally incompatible with liberalism, that for a liberal system to work, we can't think tribally in racial, cultural, I don't know, in every sense, linguistic terms?
No, I'm saying in a way the opposite. The great liberal theorists, going back to John Locke, but especially my favorite of them, my hero, James Madison, understood that what could be called tribalism, or what can also be called partisanship of a certain type, and what Madison called faction, that this is a fundamental driver of the human species, and that you're not going to make it go away. And that the flaw of most of these other systems, monarchy and autocracy and theocracy, is that they tried to stamp out the identities of individuals and of groups and tribes and simply impose one on everybody. We're all now going to be the tribe of Catholics, for example. We're going to stamp, and a certain type of Catholic, you're going to stamp out all the heresies. Liberalism's innovation is to say, no, that's stamping out human nature. We will always be tribal and partisan and factional. So you want to build a society where people in their factions and in their tribes can nonetheless get along through negotiation and compromise and persuasion. And then you set up mechanisms and constitutions that try to get them to do that. And then you teach norms that get them to support those things. And that's all extremely difficult. But the core of liberalism is understanding that the factions are always there and managing them is always hard. And guess what? The things that we thought were working haven't been working so well.
Yeah, so John, you're collapsing tribalism and faction, Madison's notion of faction.
Am I
I've never
wrong?
thought of them. Well, I've never thought of them quite in the same way.
They're kind of
Tribalism.
different.
I mean, people are. Didn't Madison mean by faction people's self-interest? So business owners or people who exporters or importers or people's whose interest happen to coincide. That's what faction is. Tribalism is something that we tend to be born into tribes. And isn't that the problem that liberals have with tribalism? That it can't be overcome? I mean, with the classic one is race. You're born white or black. You can't choose what you're born and how you can't repaint yourself. So there is a difference between, I mean, in my sense, between tribalism and faction. But
yeah, I would dispute that, actually. I think my interpretation of Madison is right, which is that these are all just forms of groupiness. You've seen these experiments. There are tons of them, but you take students and you divide them randomly into two groups, and you put one of them in red jerseys and the other in green jerseys, and you tell them they're different groups, and then you put them through experiments like how altruistic they are, and they almost instantly bond into groups based on entirely random categories with people they've never known before. And so you can be born into one of those things. Of course, I actually am not convinced race is something you're born into. I think it's socially constructed to a large extent. But setting that aside, I think all of these things just come down to the natural tendency of humans to form groups and to form loyalties in those groups, and then have insiders and outsiders. Partisanship, which used to be pretty fungible, we saw bipartisanship all the time, has now become tribal, just in the sense that people put their identities into it. They define it as an identity. And, the color jersey you wear can define your identity. And certainly your identity as a farmer can define it. So however you call it, I think we're talking about the same basic phenomenon, which is, what do you do about our tendency to groupiness and to, I guess I hate this term, but I'll use it, othering, saying the world is people like us and people like them, and we're people like us and we're against people like them.
John, Tuesday's moral catastrophe, it was a couple of Tuesdays ago. Is it a unique catastrophe?
No.
There was an interesting piece in this weekend's Financial Times by Mark Mazar, excellent Columbia University historian. And what he said, he was suggesting that Trump's victory will change America. That goes without saying. And Europe's going to respond very differently. He doesn't believe it's fascist, but he said something very interesting in the piece. He said the US is the only nation in the world currently governed by a document drawn up in the age of the Enlightenment. Of course, perhaps the most influential figure in that is your hero, Madison. Does this make what's happening in America, this rejection, in your eyes at least, of liberalism, so particularly important? Is it the final nail in the coffin of the Enlightenment, John?
Well, it's certainly not the final nail. This is an ongoing story. And for just the reasons we've discussed, I have hope that I and my friends and the people who were with us at the conference that you mentioned in July will be shaken out of our complacency and find ways both to solve or help solve the kinds of problems that liberalism has, and also find better ways to explain it. And its enormous advantages. I can tell you that I think Chinese communism, for example, is not the solution. I do think it's important to note that what's happening now is not just in America; it's global. We've seen this year has been, according to the people who look at such things, this year has been a record year for anti-incumbency all around the world. In fact, as far back as you look,
inflation, of course, has been. I mean, as you say in your Brookings piece, a very ordinary election. Inflation historically always made it very hard for incumbents to win, to keep their power in an election.
Well, that's right. But everywhere you look, Japan, we had a serious upset. Germany's government has collapsed. Macron's government has collapsed. Everywhere you look, you see voters who are unhappy with the status quo and grabbing vehicles to oppose it. And sometimes those vehicles are far right-wing parties in Europe, which have been fringe or non-existent until now. And America is part of that trend. And one of the things that folks like me need to try to figure out is, why are people so damn unhappy?
Well, you know that. You don't need, I mean, you just need to look at the inflation numbers, the poverty numbers, the inequality numbers, the addiction numbers, the death of despair numbers. That's not hard for a guy like you to understand, is it, John?
A lot of those numbers are better. A lot of the
But that
problems we
doesn't
have.
still make it, I mean, they haven't gone away.
Well, sure. There are always problems. I'm not denying that. I'm not saying something silly. But the American economy was objectively much better than people gave it credit for. People were telling pollsters that the United States economy today is as bad as it was in the Great Depression of the 1930s, and I can tell you that's just not the case. And there's, increasingly people attribute what's happening not just to objective factors like economic growth and inflation, though of course those are there, I wouldn't deny it, but to anomie, to things like loneliness, to the lack of connection. David Brooks has a very big article in The Atlantic on the many ways, you alluded to some of them, that people are finding their lives coming up short. And a lot of them have to do with intangible factors, like, do they have friends? Do they feel secure if they're in trouble? Do they have someone to call? Do they feel that they live in an environment which is safe? And those things, we at Brookings pay attention to the numbers, right? These intangibles are harder to cope with.
I wonder, it'd be really interesting. I don't know if anyone's done the research on this, John, whether your point about the age of anxiety and loneliness, David Brooks has written about it, all sorts of other people. It's one of the dominant intellectual strains of our age. But I wonder whether anyone's done any research of whether a sense of loneliness is more dominant in the minds of Harris voters versus Trump voters. My guess, and it's just a guess, is that the Trump voter is less likely to be lonely than the Harris voter because they're less urban, less bound up in all the anomie of post digital capitalism.
I know those numbers exist. I don't know what they show. A couple of related trends, which I do know a little bit, is that indicators go in different directions. Progressives, people on the left with college degrees and all that, who are very progressive, are more neurotic and less happy than conservatives. And that stands to reason, since they seem to spend their days telling themselves that we will never have progress on race and that we live in a terrible and unjust society of settler colonialism. So there's that. On the other hand, we have a scholar at Brookings who studies happiness and hope. Happiness not in the sense of mood, how cheerful I am, but life satisfaction. How good do I think my life is? And the ethnic group in America, the socioeconomic group, I should say, that is least hopeful is working class whites. And it turns out college-educated whites are also low on the hope scale. And the most hopeful people in America are African Americans.
Well, I know this from families, they've been through so much hell historically that whatever the situation now doesn't compare with what happened in the past. Yeah, that's a
bingo. Yes, that's exactly what Carol thinks. That when we don't know, we don't have a... We don't know the whys of this.
Who's the person at Brookings who does this?
Carol Graham. She's terrific. She's studying hope, actually. But that's right. The trajectory for African Americans is much like my trajectory as a gay American, which is you've seen this remarkable progress, and that gives you hope. The trajectory for whites, especially working class whites, who really are having a bad time economically, they're looking back at a world in which they had more status.
Yeah, but I take your point on that. But my point was not on that. It was about loneliness as opposed to unhappiness. But that maybe we can get her on the show. I'm guessing, John, I'm the last cheerful progressive, am I? That's why you were on my show.
Are you cheerful, Andrew?
I'm very cheerful. I'm sort of, I always think Americans are miserable optimists, and I'm a cheerful pessimist. So whatever happens now makes me even more cheerful. When the news is good, always makes me nervous and miserable. You've talked, John, and we're going to reverse this actually next week. You're going to interview me because you're one of the people I most respect. So I'm interested in getting your take on what I think. You'll help me figure that out. You keep on mentioning complacency. You and I were at this liberalism for the 21st century, and I think I told you at the time I thought it was very complacent, very elitist. It sort of reflected the problem rather than the solution. One thing that I have to admit I disagreed with you in your moral catastrophe piece was the idea that Harris, and I'm quoting you here, ran an exemplary campaign. I mean, okay, everybody knows she got thrown in the deep end and all the rest of it. You don't need me to tell you that. But I don't think it was, I think it was anything but exemplary. It was complacent. She had no, in my view at least, no sense of why she wanted to be president. She rested on the Biden assumption that the economy was good and that there was no real reason to fundamentally change that. So what was, in your view, exemplary about the Harris campaign? She didn't manifest any kind of confidence. She wasn't even willing to go on the Joe Rogan show because apparently some of her staff were uncomfortable with that. Well, what do you admire about the Harris campaign?
Well, as I think you agree, she was cast into extremely challenging circumstances.
Yeah, I've said that. I acknowledge that. But
and you acknowledge that. And when I say exemplary, I don't mean against a standard in which she could start from scratch, go through an entire primary campaign, develop policy proposals, and most importantly, and this really is important, not be an incumbent. She was an incumbent. She tried to not to sound like she wasn't an incumbent, turn the page and all of that. But the voters are not dumb. And they said, well, you are the sitting vice president of the United States. And they refused to separate her from Joe Biden, whose popularity was extremely low 40s, high 30s. That's a massive headwind. And those are conditions she can't change. The conditions that she could change begin with handling Biden extremely well. There were no leaks from the Harris operation trying to nudge Biden out, and that actually helped get him out. Then she was able to corral the delegates she needed in 36 hours. That seemed like a very heavy lift. People were predicting.
I think it reflects very poorly, actually, on the Democratic Party that they were pushed into this.
No, they got the delegates. Now, part of that is because the Democrats didn't have time to go through a proper primary process, and people who thought that they could somehow do an abbreviated version of that in 3 weeks were just on drugs. There was no way that was going to happen. She raised a stupendous amount of money. She had an extremely good team with essentially zero internal divisions. She crushed.
She was spending it. I mean, she raised ridiculous amounts of money that were just wasted.
Well, I mean, I don't know. She'll probably wind up within a percentage point of Trump in the popular vote. And the places where
a victory then, a moral victory, John?
No. I'm saying that the places where she spent money, which are the 7 swing states, the evidence that people who study this thing are saying is that all of those places were much closer than the places that she didn't spend money. And part of that is because she was able to focus resources. But, to continue, she crushed her opponent in a debate. So I think when I say exemplary, I mean, I think she did as good a job as you can expect someone to do in that situation. She still lost because the country wanted a change. And they understood that she's the status quo.
On this one. I mean, she took no risks. She was unwilling. There was no reason. She's not in Biden's pocket. There was no reason why she couldn't have crushed Biden. When she was asked, the famous moment, to me, the whole campaign was finished when I think it was on one of the morning shows. Someone said, well, how would you be different from Biden? And there was this long, and then she had no idea. The fact that she'd clearly been thinking about this for years. I mean, it was obvious that what might happen, but she had no idea of how she was different. I mean, what most troubles me about Harris, and this perhaps goes to the complacency of the liberal establishment, and you're not really part of that establishment, although you know it better than I do, is their complacency, their idea that actually things are pretty good. and that Biden did a good job and the economy was good and it's not Trump. And if you just reminded people that the economy was improving and you're not Donald Trump, and you're a small liberal, then you're going to win. To me, it was anything but exemplary.
Well, we'll agree to disagree, but I will agree with you that that was a terrible answer. It was a bad moment.
But it's more than just a bad answer. The truth is, it was an honest answer.
Here's where we disagree, which is, like it or not, she's the incumbent. And it is not credible for an incumbent. It just never has been for a vice president to say the administration that just happened wasn't me, because it was her. So that moment was a bad moment and she could and should have done better. But I think the screw up was that the Biden administration ignored immigration and inflation for too long. And in hindsight, that's pretty clear. But that was baked in, right? That's the world she inherited. So I guess we could go round and round on that. If they'd had a full primary process and Biden had gotten out and you had someone who was not in government like Josh Shapiro or maybe Gavin Newsom, all these people have their flaws. Gavin Newsom a lot better than I do.
Yeah, and Newsom's been on the show. I think he's a bit too slick.
Yeah, he might be. But then I think you would have had time to develop those things. But I think what we did have as a test in this election, she ran as an avatar of the Biden administration because she was. You just can't run away from that. She's sitting vice president. And she ran into an electorate which said, you know what? We think Biden is a failed president. And that makes you a failed vice president. And we don't want another term of that. We want something else. That's Donald Trump. And where people like me fell on our faces is that we tried to tell them, well, Donald Trump is unacceptable. So go with the failed presidency, go with the failed administration. And they're not willing to do that.
Right. And you write about, in your excellent piece, The Moral Catastrophe, you're right, you quote Tocqueville on elections determining norms, which is certainly the case in this last election. Briefly going back to Harris, what about, does the fact that she seemed to be running by committee, she's like an American car or something, designed by committee, completely unwilling, she's the reverse of Trump, completely unwilling to take risks, completely unwilling to do or say anything that might offend anyone or create any kind of controversy. Is that just a problem with Harris and her camp, or is this a problem, John, with small L liberals in America today, that this unwillingness to challenge, to tell the truth? Coming back to Biden, there seems to be, in my view at least, a kind of conspiracy amongst mainstream media not to tell the truth about Biden over the last 2 or 3 years, that he was clearly not fit to be president, that he was too old, that he'd lost something that made him barely presidential, and yet the press never focused on this. So why is and I'm part of your class, why is our class so unwilling to take risks?
Well, there's two things there. One is about the coverage of Biden, and that's a separate conversation, and I have a minority view on that.
Do you agree or disagree with me?
I disagree. I think that the reason that Biden's condition wasn't broadly reported is that the administration hid it and they clobbered you if you tried to write on it. And when the Wall Street Journal finally was able to get a story in about it in April, they could only get one person to go on the record about Biden's condition, and that was former Speaker McCarthy, who is not an unbiased source. Biden held essentially no press conferences. He shut that down. He withheld himself from the press. I think he's Parkinsonian. They have good days and they have bad days. Doesn't mean Parkinson's disease, by the way. There are lots of things that can cause the things you see of him, the kind of the slurred speech and the slack-jawed look and the stumbling gait. But he was hiding that, and he was abetted in hiding it by people who should not have done that. But
it's the whole administration. It's all these cabinet officers.
But that's a side question.
Okay.
Your big question. Yeah, I shouldn't have gone down that rabbit hole because who knows. But your big point is, are liberals refusing to take risks and tell the truth? I don't know about liberals because it's it's a very big group. And my friends at the Cato Institute, for example, who are classical liberal libertarians, say all kinds of things that are very risky, like privatize all the schools. I do think, though, that that's the case about Democrats, and that they should, for example, have separate, Biden and Harris and other people should have separated themselves from the academic left, the genderqueer people and the critical race theory, social justice, critical everything people. They should have separated themselves from those people. And they should have been willing to say that a woman is an adult human female. And that they've been afraid to do that because that part of the coalition can be so noisy. And in fact, when things are this close in the country, when you're having one 50-50 election after another, you're afraid of losing part of your base. But there, yeah, I agree with you. Democrats need to learn a page from Republicans, who have been nothing if not risk takers.
The party then needs its sister soldier movement. You've been very generous with your time, John, and we're going to continue this conversation. Still a lot to talk about. Back in August 2022, a couple of years ago, it seems a long time ago now, you wrote for The Atlantic, Trump's second term would look like this, and you talked about the extinction of American democracy. Where are you? I mean, you're obviously worried. These are difficult times, to put it euphemistically, from your point of view. How fearful are you about this second term? I mean, we're speaking after the appointment of certain certain cabinet ministers, appointments, the Attorney General, RFK Jr. Where have you? I mean, I don't want to. There's a whole episode to talk about here, but when you look back to August 2022, so a couple of years ago, more than 2 years ago, when you talked about the Trump second term, are you more or less pessimistic about the fate of American democracy?
Well, you are right that would be a great opening point for a separate episode, because there's so much to discuss there. And I am so interested in your view of that, which has been very different from mine, and perhaps I hope will prove correct. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm about a 9. The things that I said in August of 2022 that they would do, they are doing, and they can do. And we know what they are because they've either told us what they are or they've actually tried to do them in Trump's first term. And we will see them unfold. And if I'm correct about the 6th out of 6 of them, the one thing that he did not do in his first term, then that's the end of liberal democracy in America as we've known it. And what that 6th thing is the open violation of court orders, making Supreme Court orders, rulings optional. I fully expect that they will do that. Now, I hope I'm wrong about that. But if that happens, in addition to the other 5 things that we predicted and that we know they want to do and that they're now setting about doing, yeah, I think we live in a fundamentally different kind of regime. It's not, of course, China, but it's in the direction of Hungary. And yeah, so I'm pretty much hair on fire. I'd like to be wrong, though. I'd like you to be right. And I, as you know, I give your view great weight. I view you as kind of the canary in the mine shaft of people who say, I'm too hysterical.
Well, I like being called the canary in the mine shaft. Jonathan Rauch, we will continue this conversation. We're going to switch hats. It's going to be my hair on fire the next time around. John's going to come back on the show and talk to me.
You have a lot more hair to set on fire.
Yeah, well, for the moment. But we will continue this conversation. John, it's always an honor and a lot of fun to have you on the show. You're certainly the most human of liberals, I would say. And you warts and all, you don't deny any aspect of the liberal condition. So it's always an honor to have you on the show, which is, I think, the essence of liberalism, in contrast to some of the utopianism of other ideologies.
Thank you.
So
Andrew Keene meets out his compliments with parsimony, so I take that as a good one.
Good, John. Well, honor, and I hope you survive the next week, because I want you back on the show and you're going to interview me. So we'll talk again in the not too distant future. John Rauch, keep well, keep worrying. We need you to worry. If you worry, then it makes it easier for the rest of us. Thank you so much.
on the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there.